Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
And then later a scientist at the Biomedical Engineering Department at USC. And for the last 5-6 years, he's been an assistant professor of cognitive science at UCSD, where he's been working on stochastic optimal control and Bayesian inference to understand how the brain does sensor-motor integration. And some of the methods he works on are inspired by biology. It's always wonderful to see what biology has discovered in its random walk, buffeted by natural selection, to help us understand how to do better math. So, Imo.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and hello to all the remote audience. So I work on both biological and engineering/math side of things. What I'll do today is going to start with sort of a highlight a few projects without much detail, and then the second half of the talk I'm going to go into detail into the latest and greatest thing that I've been doing. Hopefully give you both breadth and depth of some sort. I guess most people are actually not here, but those of you who are here, please feel free to interrupt with questions at any time. I really like that. So the general framework I work in is stochastic optimal control. What does that mean? You have something that you want to control. In this case, it's an arm, but it could be a robot or even some sort of virtual agent in some software environment. And it has some constraints that are imposed by the way the thing is designed. And usually we consider it as a stochastic system. It has noise both in the actuator and in the sensor loops. It can also have delays. So the idea is that if you're given a body, and you're given some sort of objectives that you want to accomplish with that body, or that sometimes it's called a plan. It's the thing you control. What is the best you can do? Okay, suppose you have no constraints on computation, you're infinitely smart, and you can design the best possible control system ever. How is that thing going to work, and what it's going to look like? So you can show mathematically that the way you do that is you need to build a base optimal state estimator that's trying to figure out what the world is doing, and then take the outputs of that, which are belief states, or you could represent them in some low-dimensional way as means and covariances, let's say, and then put them into a feedback control law, which is basically a mapping from the estimated state of the world into instantaneous commands that you send to your actuators. And then the whole thing is running in a loop, of course. This arrow is here because you have delays and noise in your sensory feedback. And so if you want to come up with optimal estimates of the state of the world and your body, you need to take into account a copy of the motor commands that you send to your muscles. In biology, that's called an efferent copy. It just means a copy of whatever you send here. So why would the brain do the best possible thing? Well, that's sort of evolution is. You can think of evolution as a big optimization process that's making things better and better. In fact, if you look at the computational models of evolution, they're genetic algorithms, which are basically methods for numerical optimization that tend to be somewhat robust and somewhat slow, but that's what they are. And indeed, there is more and more data accumulating that if you look at the details of biological movement, you can understand those details from the viewpoint of optimality. So there are a number of high-profile review papers recently that you can check out if you want that summarize a lot of the experimental evidence for it. And the story usually goes as follows. Like you come up with a task that you present to human subjects or some animal, and you figure out what would be the optimal behavior in that task. So, for example, if it's a perceptual task, you know that the organism has some priors about what might be going on, and there's some sensory stimuli, and you have some data likelihood, and then you use Bayes' rule to combine them into a posterior. And then you ask the organism to make decisions, and you see if it goes according to the posterior, and the answer is usually yes. On the motor side, you can ask, for example, I have a task which requires me to take my fingertip to press that button here. And so you can write down a cost function, which specifies what does it mean to perform well. Okay, so in this case, it means, well, make sure you press the button at the end. And you want to to put things like be lazy, don't fatigue your muscles. So when you build sort of sensible cost functions like this, and then you solve an optimal control problem, and you look at the details of the movement, they tend to agree with data very nicely. So in this talk, I'm going to highlight a couple of examples of this from my lab, but I should emphasize that there are many others, and you can look at these review papers if you're interested. Now, of course, everyone in engineering knows that being optimal is good, and everyone would love to accomplish that, but the question is, how do you pull it off? I mean, if you have a complicated thing that you want to control, let's say a bipedal robot that's supposed to walk around and pick up your coffee cup and put it in the dishwasher, how do you actually know what is the best thing to do? I mean, the brain may be smart enough to know it, but how do we as engineers build a system that does that? And of course, we don't know. If we knew, we would have robots going around serving coffee, because the hardware problems are mostly solved. It's that just we don't know how to control the robots. That's why they're not walking around serving coffee. And it's convenient that the brain already has a solution, because by observing it closely and trying to figure out what sort of algorithms and shortcuts it uses, we might be able to come up with tricks that tell us how to do better control in artificial systems, as well as understand the brain better. So I'll tell you about a couple of properties of optimal control systems that may be somewhat non-obvious, and they seem to be very relevant to biology. So the first one is something that we found a while ago, and we call it the minimal intervention principle. So what that says is if you have a redundant task means that you have lots of degrees of freedom, like all my degrees of freedom of the arm. I want the fingertip to go here, but there are all these things that can happen that don't really affect the task performance. And similarly, as I'm moving towards this button, my arm can go this way or that way. It doesn't really matter. The button doesn't care how I get there. Right? So almost everything you ever do with your body is a redundant task. Like have all these degrees of freedom. Now, if you look at the classical ways to control mechanical systems with things like PID control, what you do is you pick some reference trajectory in advance. And that reference trajectory is one out of infinitely many ways to accomplish the task. Okay? And then you do that in some planning phase. And then in the planning phase, you resolve all the redundancy, basically. And then you have a pretty dumb control system that's just basically trying to track this reference trajectory. And if something pushes you away, or you have, say, modeling errors, so your body doesn't actually respond the way you thought, and you deviate, the controller basically pushes you back. Okay? So here's the simplest possible model of a redundant task. Suppose you have two state variables, x1 and x2, and the task is to keep their sum equal to some target value. Okay? So if you plot them in state space, x1 versus x2, so the state of the system is a point somewhere in this plane, you have one direction where x1 plus x2 vary, so you don't want fluctuations here. There's another direction where it doesn't matter what you do, because here x1 plus x2 is constant. Now, the traditional approach to control will say, well, pick a point in this space, okay? And in a planning phase. And then no matter what happens, just push the system towards that point. Okay? So if you were to visualize the control law as some sort of vector field in that space, which basically takes a point and pushes it somewhere, the traditional control law would be something that sort of all the arrows point towards the center. Turns out the optimal thing to do is not that. Instead, the optimal thing to do is to push towards this manifold of redundant states. Okay, so these are the actions of the optimal controller that are shown here. Why is that the optimal thing to do? Well, turns out there are two reasons. One is that obviously you're going to save energy. Right? So if you push towards this point versus pushing towards that point, obviously this takes less energy to get you here. And energy is very important to both biological and artificial systems. Like you don't want to run out of battery prematurely. The other thing you improve is accuracy, it turns out. So that's a bit non-obvious. So if you watch biological systems, you very quickly find out that the variability in their movement scales with the amount of effort they exert. Okay, so the stronger you push, the more noisy your muscles become. In fact, you've all experienced that. If you want to touch something big like a table, you can make a very quick movement. But if I want to touch something small like a pointer, I kind of have to slow down. Right? So there's a natural speed-accuracy trade-off. Okay, so why do you slow down if you want more accuracy? The reason you slow down is because fast movement requires big control signals. Big control signals are associated with more noise, which is sort of generated by your brain, and that makes you inaccurate. Okay? So the noise in the motor system is signal dependent. It basically scales with the amount of the signal. And so smaller controls are not only going to save you energy, but they're also going to make you more accurate. Okay, and this is shown actually here. So this ellipse shows you what will happen to that system if you act on it with this control law that's pushing towards this manifold. And it has the signal-dependent node that's pushing it around. Okay, so if you look at the fluctuations in the state of that system, you're going to find a covariance ellipse that's sort of elongated like that. So you have more variability in the directions that are not relevant and less variability in the directions that you care about. If you act on this with a control law that's just pushing towards the middle, you're going to get a sort of a more circular thing that looks like that. Okay, so if you compare a classical control law, which will give you the circle, and an optimal control law, which will give you the ellipse, what you find is that the optimal controller can actually do better in the things that matter, but only by allowing variability in things that don't matter. Okay, so the point is that if you want to be accurate, you can't control too much. You have to sacrifice your ability to control in the things that are not relevant to you. There are lots of illustrations of that in behavioral data. So here, let me show you two of them. So here, this person was asked to point to targets on his body. And he's holding this wooden thing. It has two tips, 1 and 2. And there's a sensor here that's tracking the position and orientation of the thing. Okay, so he just does that repeatedly. And then if you collect enough movements, you can ask how variable are the movements at different points along the movement. And so we can just summarize the data. So this is the path length of the movement going from 0 to 100%. Okay, and you see two things. One is that tip 1, which is sort of the working tip, is controlled more accurately than tip 2. So on this axis is the positional variance. Okay, so even though this is sort of symmetric for mechanical points, the brain actually cares about one tip and allows the other one to fluctuate. And the other thing you see is that the variability of both of them is reduced towards the end of the movement where you have to hit the target. But the rest of the time, it's kind of allowed to fluctuate. Here's a similar example. So here, this person has to go around this shelf and hit this target. And later, that target is going to jump around and probe the feedback control of the person. But for now, it's just sitting stationary. If you look at the variability of the movements, you see there's more dispersion here than towards the end. So that's a very well-established experimental finding and sort of agrees very nicely with what you would expect from an optimal controller. Now, if you look closely here, you realize something interesting. So what does it mean for a controller to push towards some manifold? Well, it means that the controller has access to these independent control variables, U1 and U2. So what they do is basically they push the two state variables independently. Okay? So the controller can choose to control these two muscles, let's say, independently, but it doesn't want to. Instead, what it wants to do is couple them and set them equal to something, which in this case is some function of these state variables. Okay, so that follows from the fact that these arrows are parallel. Now, this idea of controlling a highly redundant system by coupling the degrees of freedom is a very old idea in biology. It goes back almost a century. And the idea is called the motor synergy. So synergy is like creating a high-level control knob that you can tweak, and then that has some distributed action on all the low-level degrees of freedom. And if you get the right high-level control knobs, you can simplify your life a lot and still accomplish the right thing. Here's an illustration of that point. So here's a more complicated example. This is a sort of a model system. It has 3-point masses that can slide up and down. These are muscle-like actuators that can both pull and push. I have 5 of them. The task that we give this thing is to make this top point mass go through some targets at a certain point in time. So this is time. This is the position of the 3 points. And we specify those targets, and we build the optimal controller for that thing using sort of linear quadratic methods. Okay, what you see is that the top point mass is controlled very accurately, and these guys are sort of fluctuating. Okay? So now the control system is mapping from estimated states to actions. Okay, so this system has about 12 state variables and 5 actuators. So it's a 12 to 5 matrix, 12 by 5 matrix. So it could have full rank if it wants to. But if you look at that matrix, it turns out it actually has very low rank, 1 or 2. So you can just do singular value decomposition and find out what it is. And then when you do that, you can decompose this optimal feedback control law. You can represent it as a linear network like that. And so what it does, it takes the inputs, which are the raw sort of states, like the lengths of all these guys and the velocities of the point masses, etc. And then it compresses them into some lower dimensional space where it wants to do control. Okay, so this is the space of things that actually matter for the task. Okay, so you can think of that as compression. Then it multiplies them by some feedback gains within that reduced space. And then it expands them again and then sends them to the muscles. And for situations where we can solve for the control law, we can look at what the structure of these matrices is. So for example, this is creating two so-called motor synergies. So each column of this says, if I tweak this control knob, here's how I'm going to affect the 5 muscles. So I'm going to suppress those 2 and activate those 2 and leave this guy alone. So you get interesting structures like, for example, for this thing, the optimal controller doesn't actually need muscle 2, so it leaves it alone, even though it's there. So what this example shows is that if you have a redundant task and you do the hard work of finding the best possible way to control the system, you're going to discover that your solution has hierarchical structure in it. So it maps things into some high-level space and does things there and puts them back. Okay? Well, if you know that in advance, the question is, can you take advantage of that knowledge? And can you sort of build in that hierarchical structure a priori? So then your optimization algorithm doesn't have to take forever searching for something that you could have guessed to start with. Okay, so this, yes.
Have you spent any time beyond the biologically inspired? Have you spent time looking at the actual biology of what systems out there have been evolved to do, including searching to verify hierarchical control? That's beyond the scope of your
Oh, no, it's definitely in the scope of what we do. So this idea of motor synergies is basically about hierarchical control, and that's one of the most sort of powerful and often used theoretical ideas in motor control. That and optimality are sort of the two big theoretical things that people talk about.
That's motor control in the world of the synthetic, but into the natural and seeing what you discovered.
Yeah, so I was referring to actually the experimental field of motor control, where there are people like kinesiologists and physical therapists and psychophysicists who are actually recording a lot of movements.
So seeing the movements confirms that it gives evidence that there might be a hierarchical modeling going on at the level of the system. Mm-hmm. Anything anatomically or
okay, so
or
robotically. So in robotics, that's another story. Yes.
I'm sure you'll get to robotics in a few minutes.
Yes. Okay, so the neuroanatomy is clearly hierarchical in the sense that you have fast feedback loops going through the spinal cord, and then you have signals are going to cortex, but the spinal cord actually does something before the rest of the brain has time to respond. So it's very clear.
That's two level.
Yeah, but except cortex is really complicating. So you have the cerebellum, you have multiple cortical areas, you have the basal ganglia who does who knows what. So actually, the biological system is not strictly hierarchical. It has a clearly defined low level, which is the spinal cord. Once you go beyond that, it sort of becomes a mosaic of things that have a loose hierarchical relationship, but it's not known who does what. In terms of this idea of dimensionality reduction, is it the case that there are actually a small number of control knobs that you tweak? There's nice data from Emilio Bizzi's lab and also Simon Gifter and colleagues stimulating the spinal cords of like frogs and cats and such, and showing that no matter where you stimulate, you actually elicit one of a very small number of force fields. So basically the spinal cord has a small number of dynamic states that it wants to go to, and no matter how you stimulate, it just goes to one of them. And in frogs, they found 4 of them, for example.
Who did this work?
Emilio Bizzi and company. It was published in Science in the 90s. In motor cortex, people have been looking for evidence of this kind of muscle synergy. So you record from neurons and correlate with muscles and see other correlation patterns clustered in some way. The evidence there is sort of very hard to interpret, because once you go to cortex, it tends to be complicated. So when you talk about individual neurons, it's hard to trace this. It's probably because the abstract state variables that we talk about are not represented by a single neuron, but by large collections of neurons. So you wouldn't recognize this even if you saw it. On the behavioral side, what people do is basically collect a large data set of behavior, including muscle activity, and do some sort of PCA or nonlinear dimensionality reduction. And you find that the actual output of the brain is very low dimensional, much lower than it had to be. Going to robotics, people have been using these things for a while. So perhaps the most salient work is Osama Khatib and colleagues from Stanford. So there's something called operational space control. And the idea there is that it's actually quite similar to this. So you have some robotic system. You decide that you want to control the end effector. And what you do is you express the inertia and the Coriolis forces and everything in end effector space. And then you actually cancel them. You do something like feedback linearization. So in other words, you make your hand behave like a disembodied point mass that's just floating around. And then you can easily control it. These things tend to... Right. So you can have feedback controller in that abstract space. So if something pushes, you can push back. But if something happens in the now space, then things become more complicated. There is something called feedback linearization, which is sort of one of the few systematic ways to treat nonlinear systems, and that shows up there. So there's something called input-output feedback linearization, which is kind of hierarchical and leaves this now space where things can happen. So actually, the next slide is sort of along these lines. So here's a general, a method that we've developed, and it's related to these robotics things I mentioned. So you have a thing you want to control. Instead of having one monolithic control system, I'm going to break it up in, say, two. So we have a low-level control. It takes a state. It produces some abstract high-level state, which is some function of x. Okay, and then some high-level control decides what to do and sends a high-level command signal. And then this guy is just a translator, basically. So the job of this guy is not to execute any specific task, but instead to sort of augment the plant and turn it into a different plant. So body with a little bit of brain attached to it may be easier to control than just the body itself. Okay, and so now the high-level control can think of the brain, the body plus a little bit of brain as one big sort of body with different state. And then that can be controlled sort of on a high level. Mathematically, the way you do that is you write down the dynamics of the plant, and you have some cost function. The cost functions we use tend to have energy cost, which basically tells you to be lazy, and some sort of state-dependent cost, which tells you what you want to do. This could be anything. And then you define this high-level state, and you differentiate that, and you get the dynamics of the high-level state, which depends on this Jacobian matrix. And then you specify what you would like the dynamics of the high level to be. You actually have the freedom to do so. And then you match those two, and you find the U that sort of satisfies this constraint and at the same time minimizes energy. So using energy minimization as a regularizer for a sort of ill-posed problem. And you actually can find this low-level control law in closed form. We have a robotics paper on that, which deals with complicated cases where the pseudo-inverse doesn't exist. And you can look at the details. One interesting trick that's probably very important, actually, in many other areas is if you're treating a dynamical system in continuous time, and suppose your controls are things like forces or even the derivatives of forces, because muscles act like low-pass filters, so you're actually controlling the derivative of force. And the high level is supposed to be something like, let's say, position, so you want to do first-order control. So in other words, if you have a mismatch in the order of the derivatives, so the low level is a third-order thing and the high level is a first-order plant, how do you do this translation? So if you look at it instantaneously in continuous time, the answer is, well, you can't. However, if you imagine the system as being a discrete time system, then in a finite time step, the third derivatives can actually integrate twice and affect your first derivative. So you can actually take advantage of that to bridge the gap between dynamic orders of the model, and we have ways of doing that. Yes?
The HCI people, somewhere in the audience and someone watching your talk, have a kind of a coarse approximation they call Fitts law.
Yeah, Fitts law is very nicely predicted by these optimal control models, by the way.
That's what I'm getting at. So,
yeah.
So
there's a paper by Harris and Wolpert in '98 published in Nature, which has a beautiful model just showing for arms and also for eye movements, showing that basically you minimize endpoint errors under this signal-dependent noise. And if you put targeted different distances and scale the size, you get Fitts law perfectly out of it. You even get the little deviations from Fitts law, which it's not exactly linear fit. So for those of you who don't know, Fitts law is a relationship between the amplitude of a movement and the duration of a movement and the size of the target you're trying to hit.
It's been used quite broadly in HCI for both modeling and tracking studies. Recent extensions by Balakrishnan and Grossman to the probabilistic Fitts law also might fit in very nicely. So,
Yeah, so there was this iterative, like stochastic iterative corrections model, which is effectively a stochastic optimal control model in sort of discrete time. So it says, make a movement ballistically, see where it lands, and then compute the optimal correction. So these continuous models are sort of doing the same, but in a more realistic way, because the brain doesn't have these ballistic phases followed by another ballistic movement.
So what applications for user interface, for example, someone might have a disability with certain control theoretic attributes, and how do you make a mouse do the right thing in hitting a target, correcting for or helping or understanding that deficit, or even healthy people?
Yeah.
So that's in your talk for UCI.
Thank you. So we've been playing with this methods, and we've shown that for reasonably simple systems where we can actually compute the optimal solution independently, the solutions that we get from this match very closely. We've also been applying them to more complicated things. So here's a biomechanical model of an arm with 7 degrees of freedom and a bunch of muscles, like 20 of them. These ghostly yellow, blue things show wrapping objects. So the way you model muscles usually is you want to model how their pulling directions change as the arm moves around, and that's rather complicated. Actually, that makes the control of a biomechanical system much harder than control of a robot. Because think of a robot where all the motors are sort of floating around and changing the joints on which they operate. That's basically what your body does all the time. So anyway, so we have a model of this. Muscles also have some interesting properties, which is that muscles don't produce force in proportion to how much you activate them. But instead, they are very sensitive to the length and the velocity of the muscle. So this shows you a model that's fit to lots of data. So if you activate a muscle at a maximal level, the force that you get from it is not constant, but depends a lot on the length and the velocity of the muscle. And actually can go all the way down to 0 for physiological lengths and velocities. So for example, if I activate my biceps and I'm moving my arm very fast, somewhere in the middle of that motion, the biceps is basically unable to produce force, even though it's maximally activated. So you put all these things, put it in a model, and then try to control this thing. Here's a task where we ask this arm to go to some point high and then go down, and there's some bunch of muscle activations that this thing computes very quickly, and this seems to do the job. This is somewhat preliminary, but it works very efficiently.
So this output?
These are muscle activations that
Generated by the method you just talked about?
Yeah, by this thing. Yeah. We've tried just plain optimal control methods that are among the fastest, actually. They use sort of iterated linear quadratic Gaussian approximations. It's sort of the equivalent of second-order minimization methods adapted to control theory. And these things work well in low-dimensional systems with maybe 6, 10 state variables. But when you go to something as complex like that, they tend to break down. You seem to need...
Is it that you need more computation, or that they can't convert them?
Well, these two are perhaps the same, right? I mean, suppose you have some horrendously complicated optimization landscape, and your algorithm tends to get stuck in local minima. Now, if you restart it, 10 billion times, you probably find a faster solution, but then the amount of computation sort of scales exponentially with the dimensionality of this. So one reason for pushing this is not only to build models of how humans move, but also to fix things. So here's some technologies that you probably know about. These are implantable muscle stimulators developed by Jerry Loeb and company at USC. So you can actually implant these things in muscles. They're wireless. They just sit there. And then you power them remotely with a coil that you can wear in the sleeve of your jacket. And you can also control them remotely, so you can tell them what to do. And they stimulate the muscles. And you can implant a lot of these. So with this technology, you can effectively take over somebody's arm if they're paralyzed. And so then the question is, well, what do you do with their arm after you take over it? How do you control such a thing?
But that's stimulating muscle, you said?
Yes, it's stimulating the muscles. So muscles can be stimulated electrically, and they produce force.
You're assuming that the nerves are still there to keep muscles alive.
Okay, so muscles will stay alive as long as somebody activates them now and then. So what happens often in stroke and various disorders, you occasionally use functional electric stimulation of muscles to keep the muscles alive. You don't need a nerve to keep a muscle alive.
I thought you needed to have the...
You need some activation of the muscle. Otherwise, it would atrophy. But if you stimulate it electrically, that's good enough. The nerve doesn't have to be there.
I can check this, but it was my sense that you needed to have, for upper motor neuron diseases, where you lose upper motor neurons, you still need the lower motor neuron connection with a special neuron, whatever the neuron is sharing with the muscle to keep muscle alive. Right? And and if it's not applied to the upper motor neuron lesions, but stroke is part of that, by the way. We have the
Right, of course.
upper motor neurons are gone, but the lower motor neurons are maintaining the connection with the muscles. But we can maybe talk about this offline.
Yeah, no, but I mean, this is used, for example, there are people with spinal cord injury where the nerves are basically not sending any signals, or maybe they're saying there's specificity. Yeah. So with this technology, you can send activations to muscles, and the question is what activations you send. Another.
Is there still a problem with electrode acceptance, or is that what the?
So this thing is the electrode acceptance. So these things are biologically compatible. You inject them in a muscle, some connective tissue grows and keeps them there, and they don't move around. Jerry Loeb has them injected in his cats for like over 10 years now, and the cats are perfectly happy. And they're also injected in a number of humans, and no one has had any sort of problems with them.
I know in ALS patients, the recent big trend is with upper motor neuron problems with lower motor neurons. Okay, they are stimulating the diaphragm to keep breathing going.
Yeah.
Keep the diaphragm muscle conditioned and so on. But I know that without the lower motor neurons, you lose that too. You lose the actual muscle. Interesting.
So there's this other thing which has been generating a lot of excitement in the brain-computer interface world. So you can implant multi-electrode arrays in cortex, usually in motor cortex, and then you can do some real-time spike sorting and use that to predict what the animal intends to do with its hand. And people have gotten reasonably successful. So you can get a monkey to move a sort of virtual cursor just by thinking about it or whatever its brain is doing. Now, it's okay to move a hand, but you really want to control all these muscles in a way that they're going to move the hand, right? And there's no way you're going to decode the intended muscle activations by looking at the brain, because decoding the intended hand movement is already too complicated. So it would be nice to have a method which can map in real time sort of intended hand motions in 3D to muscle activations that are actually going to produce those motions. And it doesn't have to be perfectly optimal. It just has to be something that it doesn't fatigue patients too much. And so something like this that can very efficiently compute plausible muscle activations is a good thing. So we're hoping to apply it in that domain. See how we're doing with time. This is going to be some. Where are we? Yeah. Let me show you one more experimental finding, which is kind of interesting and sort of illustrates interesting things that fall out of optimal control. So here's an experiment. You ask people to make a movement to some target on a table. This is the target. And then during the movement, the target can jump randomly, either up or down. Okay? And you can't predict the jumping direction. That's random. But you can use visual feedback to correct during the movement. Okay? And so the target can jump at different times, either 1 or 2 or 300 milliseconds into the movement. So if it jumps early enough, you make a complete correction that goes to the target. But turns out if it jumps sort of late, you make an incomplete correction and you stop before hitting the target. Okay, and you can do sort of careful controls to show that this is not simply due to lack of time. What I mean by that is if you ask people to do just that movement from here to here, in the remaining time here, they can actually do it, and they still have plenty of time. So something sort of more unusual is going on. And when we first saw that, we thought that, well, this is really bad for our models because the optimal thing cannot possibly be to make an error. Right? Well, it turns out that is the optimal thing. So here's an optimal control model that reproduces this result very nicely, and this is some more statistics that we don't have to go into. So why does that happen? So we found that by analyzing this model, it turns out that there is a trade-off between accuracy and stability. And it's easy to understand, sort of thinking about simple physics. So suppose you have a mass on a spring, and you want to bring it to some point. The spring is like a positional feedback gain. If there is viscosity in the system, that's like a velocity feedback gain. Okay, so you can think of these optimal controllers as being having some sort of time-varying stiffness and damping built into them. Now, if you want this mass to really go to the target, you want a very stiff spring, right? So that's going to bring the mass to the target, but then it's going to make it oscillate, right? So, and so that you sacrifice stability. If you want to make the thing stable, you need to put enough damping, but that's going to tend to cause undershoots and slowness in getting to the target. So it's a fundamental trade-off, and the nervous system is subject to the same thing. So now if you if you build the optimal control law for this behavior and you look at the different feedback gains as a function of time, so Kp is the springiness of the system, is the position feedback gain. Kv is the velocity feedback gain, and this A is, you can think of it as force feedback. What you see is that the system has enough feedback gain for position errors early on, but then this thing goes to 0. And the reason is that if you have a spring constant that's large towards the end of the movement, you end up oscillating. And you don't want to do that. And so the optimal thing to do is to reduce your sensitivity to positional errors towards the end of the movement so that you stop. And so that system produces these undershoots if you perturb the target in the last minute. And that's what people do. So that analysis leads to a simple prediction, which is that if you didn't have to stop at the target, so suppose instead of just stopping somewhere, I'm supposed to hit on the target that's on the table, and the table is going to absorb the impact, so I can't oscillate. So it predicts that if you put people in that situation, that this effect should sort of disappear. And so that's what we've done here. So this robot, now you make a movement, the robot is going to move the target either left or right. And we also program sort of variable impedance into the robot. So in one condition, it's very hard, so you can actually hit the target and it's going to absorb the impact. In another condition, it's kind of very touchy and it's fragile, and if you hit it too hard, it's going to run away and pretend that it's broken, and you're not supposed to do that. So the stop condition is the one where you're supposed to stop. The hit condition is the condition where you can hit it. And then we can look at that undershoot, and we find that indeed it basically goes away when you're allowed to hit the thing. And we can model that carefully. So this is an example where it's not very exciting to look at those graphs, but if you really want to go after behavioral effects that are well quantified, you have to do psychophysics that looks somewhat boring, because that's the way you do science. You have to do simple things. And it's an illustration of how some sort of non-obvious properties fall out of optimal control. I'm going to skip this. One thing we're doing now is, instead of doing all the math here, we're replacing all the math with a big recurrent neural network. So it has the same inputs as a Bayesian estimator, has the same motor commands as the thing that goes to a muscle, high-level things that tell you what to do, like where's the target or how much time you have, etc. And now we have a well-defined movement cost. And then we're training this network such that when its motor commands go through the body, it's going to make good movements. Okay? So it's a somewhat unusual paradigm for training neural networks. It's unusual in that you don't specify what the outputs of the network should do, but you're specifying the desired effect after these outputs are filtered through something. And the whole network is in this feedback loop. So you can modify the backpropagation through time algorithm to backpropagate gradients through arbitrary dynamical systems like an arm. And then you can train it surprisingly efficiently, actually. And you can show that it approximates feedback control laws very well. And then once you do that, then you can go into the network and look at the details of the neuronal activity and compare it to neurophysiological results from people studying motor cortex. So I'm not going to go through those details, but basically you get, so this is the time into a movement. This is the direction in which the arm was asked to move, and this is the activity of the 60 neurons into a network, and you get things that look rather complicated. And if you were to look at them very closely, you'll find a lot of similarities with physiological data, but we're not going to do that here. We're also doing a number of other things like motion capture. So we've developed a system where you can put a bunch of markers on a hand or an arm, whatever. And then it's trying to track the joint angles, but it's also trying to estimate how big the different segments of the body are and where the markers are attached. The reason you want to do that is because you can never place the markers exactly where you intended, and even if you do, they can drift. So it's important to treat both of these as unknowns. Okay, so what we do is we basically build a estimator that's, you can think of it as an improved extended Kalman filter. And the state that it's estimating has both these rapidly varying quantities, that are the joint angles, and the slowly varying quantities like where the sensors are attached. So it estimates both. And it's doing both self-calibration and tracking, and you build these kinematic trees to describe the thing. And it works really well. It's actually on my website, and people can download it if they need. So this shows you consistency of estimation. So what we've done here is we have two movement sequences of 1 minute each, and there are about 40 constant parameters that are supposed to be estimated. They have to do with the dimensions of the hand and the placement of these things. And this shows you the first estimate of all these constants versus the second estimate. And even though you only have a short movement sequence, that's actually not very rich. The person is kind of wiggling their fingers a little bit. You get very consistent things. This shows you how the generative model that we fit. Basically, the predicted sensor measurements agree with the actual one. So it works really well, and it can be used safely, as far as I can tell. We're using it. This is a collaboration we're starting with a couple of people, including Yoki Matsuoka here. So the goal is to figure out how to control a hand, basically. So Yoki has been building these anthropometric hands that are really cool and they're backdrivable and all. Also collaborating with Dinesh Pai at University of British Columbia, who is building these amazingly elaborate biomechanical models with all the tendons sliding on the bone surfaces, etc. And we're also collaborating with Francisco Valero Cuevas, who does some sort of nasty things like stick needles into people's hands and guide a wire electrode into all the muscles that control one finger, say, and assuming you don't faint during the setup procedure, then they can look at the exact muscle activity of your index finger, say, when you're doing things. They also do things like take cadaver hands and attach them to force sensors and pull with various motors on the tendons and do system identification. So these guys are really serious about understanding the hand. We're hoping to adapt some of our control methods. We're also building our own little robot, which is going to be fully backdrivable. So the idea is that you mount motors very close to the joints, and then you put a cable like that. So it's a cable drive, so no gears or timing belts or anything. The reason you don't want such things is because biological motion is fully compliant. If you relax your muscles, I can push your arm, and it's going to work like a pendulum. And industrial robots don't do that. They're not backdrivable because of all the friction and stiction in the gears, basically. And so the idea is to make this modular thing, which basically has like 1 degree of freedom like that, and one like that, and one like that. And once we have that, then we can either have a small walking animal that walks, or we can turn it upside down, and all of a sudden we have a hand that can manipulate things. That's what we're getting into. Okay, so this was just a brief overview of a bunch of projects. Yes, please. How do we sense force? We haven't fully decided yet. So we are. I mean, one could put. So there's going to be a sort of tendon-like thing going here. You could put a force sensor here. Your actuator is going to have very low friction. Like these things have low friction. I mean, another thing you can do is put a force sensor here to detect touch with the environment, and we'll probably have to do that. I don't know. Haven't decided that yet. So I mean, my students are building that as we speak, hopefully. Okay, so what I want to do now, Eric, how much longer should I talk?
Well, you have to go to 11:30.
We'll start kind of late, like 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, good.
We have some discussion intermixed.
Okay.
That's fine with people.
Okay, so the next thing I'll do is show you some math, but I think it's very interesting math and it's worth looking at. The idea is to reformulate stochastic optimal control problems in a way that makes them easier to solve. Okay, so I've been telling you all along that I sort of solved the problem, but really I've solved it using either low-dimensional systems where I can do brute force methods or high-dimensional systems where I use linear sort of quadratic approximations. And none of these are viable for the kinds of things that we want to do. So the question is, can you find a large enough class of nonlinear and even discrete systems where the problem becomes easier? And I've been able to do that. And basically, I've been able to reduce the problem to a linear eigenvalue problem for a very large class of systems. And so that allows you to do things like approximate shortest paths in a graph with arbitrary precision by solving a linear eigenvalue problem, or solve Markov decision processes, or continuous control problems by solving linear differential equations. And so I'll show you how some of that works. There's a preprint on my website if you want to look at the details. I don't think I should go through all of them here. So I'll start with a discrete case, and just want to introduce the terminology that's normally used, and then I'll show you how I've modified the problem. Okay, so I have some state space, X, these are discrete states. There are actions U that you can take at different states, or controls, the same thing. You have some transition probabilities, so if you're in state X and choose control U, you have a certain probability of going to state Y. So this is called the Markov decision process. You have some costs you're going to pay that depend on where you are and what action you picked. And these are, you want to minimize the sum of those things. You can define the cumulative performance in many ways, like discounted reward or average cost per step or whatever. I'm going to work with one of them and show you results for other things. Okay, now, the key quantity that you work with in optimal control is this thing called the optimal value function. Okay? So optimal value function is a notion of long-term performance. It says if you start at state X and you're infinitely smart and you behave optimally from now on, how much cost you can expect to accumulate. And that's V. If you know that, you can basically act greedily with respect to it and you find optimal actions very quickly. And so a lot of optimal control and reinforcement learning and dynamic programming and Bayesian decision theory and such have to do with computing that function, basically. In things like chess, what people do is a lot of chess experts get together and try to figure out what that function should be using various heuristics. Okay, so it satisfies something called the Bellman equation, which is very easy to understand. It says that this optimal value function is the minimum of all possible controls of the instantaneous cost you're going to pay plus the expected value of the next state that you're going to find yourself. Okay, so that's sort of an obvious consistency condition. And that's the basis of most methods for optimal control or dynamic programming or reinforcement learning. Now, if you look at that equation, it's not really an equation because it has this unsolved minimization in it. So it's a way to characterize the function, but it's a horribly nonlinear and non-monotonic, etc. So it's very unpleasant. So now I'm going to show you how you can define a class of problems where this minimization can be performed analytically in closed form. And so once we get rid of that, then we're going to get a self-consistency for V, which is the regular algebraic equation. And then we're going to discover that the resulting equation is in fact linear. And so it's very easy to solve. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to modify the notion of what it means to control something. So maybe it's easier to explain that with a picture. Suppose you have 3 possible states you can go to. So it's a little graph. You can go to 3 states, 1, 2, and 3. Okay? Now, in a stochastic system, the actions that you pick correspond to transition probabilities. So let's say the action 1, in quotes, means that you have high probability of going to state 1 and low probabilities to going to the other 2 states, similarly for 2 and 3. Now, you can think of those as being points in this simplex of possible probability distributions. So this is just a triangle in this positive quadrant of the space. Every point here is a normalized probability. Now, so what this picture shows you is that the traditional formulation of control has a lot of constraints in it. You arbitrarily pick that those 3 points are the only ones that are allowed, and that gave you some discrete optimization problem. And discrete optimization problems are hard to solve. If you turned it into a continuous optimization problem, then you have hope for solving it. So that's what we're going to do. Instead of allowing only those 3 points, we're going to allow everything on the simplex. So now the actor or the controller can basically choose the transition probabilities of the system and completely override the system dynamics if it wants to. Okay? However, it's going to pay a price for doing that. And the price is going to be like an energy cost. So the more you interfere with the baseline sort of passive dynamics of the system, the more of an energy cost you're going to pay. Okay? So we're going to define the baseline dynamics as being some probability. So some point in this simplex called P bar. And this says if we don't act at all, what is the system going to do on its own? And that's P bar. And then if we act, well, we can act in any way we wish, but we're going to pay a price. The price is shown by this color plot here. So it's basically the KL divergence between the baseline dynamics and whatever you choose to act. Okay, so the further away you deviate, the more of a price you pay. So this is formalized here. So this transition probability, so probability of going from X to Y given action U, now U becomes a whole vector of real numbers as opposed to just a symbol. And you just evaluate that vector at the next state. We're going to impose the constraint that if the passive dynamics cannot take you from X to Y, then the control cannot do that either. Okay, and that's important because suppose I have an agent that's supposed to go through some maze and go to a target. If I allow the agent to teleport itself to a target, that's not good, right? So I have to constrain it to only go to neighboring states. So that's the idea of this. And then this action cost is going to be whatever cost you want on the state, plus the KL divergence between the probability you choose to act on and this baseline dynamics, and KL divergence is the expected value of the log probability ratio. Okay, so it turns out we can solve this problem in closed form. I'm not actually going to go through derivation, so we're going to skip all the black stuff in the middle, and you can look at the slides if you want. I'm just going to tell you what happens. So this is our Bellman equation. You're minimizing over all possible u's. Instantaneous cost plus the expected value of the cost for the next state. And if you look at that math, basically what happens is that you turn that into a minimization over KL divergences. Okay? And KL divergence is this conveniently convex thing which has a global minimum when two things are equal. And so that's why you can solve this minimization in closed form. And what you get is that the optimal action, or the optimal control, has a very simple expression. It's basically the passive dynamics weighted by the exponent of the optimal value function. Okay? So if you think of optimal value function V as energy, this is something like a weighted Gibbs distribution. Like if this was uniform, that would be exactly a Gibbs distribution with optimal value function being energy. Okay? And then the Bellman equation no longer has minimization in it, and it's just this V of x is equal to instantaneous cost plus log of sum of x of these value functions. And the algebra here is pretty simple, but we don't have time for it. So now we've basically gotten rid of the minimization. We have a closed form solution for the optimal controls given the optimal value function. So now if we can find the optimal value function, we're in business. And that function now satisfies the self-consistency condition, basically this being equal to this, which doesn't have minimization in it. Furthermore, if you look closely, you see that I have this exponent here and I have this log. So if I exponentiate this whole equation, I'm going to get the exponent of V here. The exponent is going to cancel this log, and I have the exponent of V here. Okay? So this thing looks nonlinear, but in fact it is linear in the exponent of V. Okay? So we can now define this exponentially transformed optimal value function. It's going to be called Z of x, which is just this term. Okay, it's given here. And then in terms of this new function Z, the Bellman equation becomes linear. So Z of x has to be equal to this exponentiated state cost. Then you sum over the passive dynamics of that Z. This is, of course, just an expectation operator, right? So you're summing over the probability of all possible next states. Okay, so this is that. We can write it in vector notation. So you can put all the states into a big column vector. You can put these guys into a big diagonal matrix, call it Q. And you can put all these guys into a big square matrix called P bar. And then the optimal value function satisfies this linear equation. So basically, you're looking for the largest eigenvector of Q times P, and you're guaranteed that it's going to have eigenvalue 1. Okay, so such things can be solved very efficiently, especially when this is a sparse matrix with things like the power method. So basically, you do this simple-minded iteration, and it converges exponentially. And the rate of convergence is given by the second largest eigenvalue of this thing, which is sort of a standard. Okay, so this summarizes the result for what I just said. You can formulate the control problem in other ways. So you can ask infinite horizon discounted cost. Get a similar thing, but the elements of this vector now raised to the power of the discount factor. You can have an infinite horizon average cost per stage. And what you get here is something similar. It's again an eigenvalue problem, except now the eigenvalue is unknown. Here it used to be 1. Here you don't know what it is. You have to find it. It's still largest eigenvalue. And then the average cost happens to be the negative log of that. You can also have a finite horizon with a given final cost, and you go backward in time, and it just becomes a recursion. Okay, so all the traditional formulations of optimal control can be handled and give you a simple system. So let me give you a couple of examples of how you can use this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to develop something like a Q-learning algorithm in reinforcement learning. So the idea of Q-learning is you have an agent. It can sample the environment. It doesn't have a model, and yet it wants to act optimally. Okay, so how can you learn to do that? So remember, this is the Bellman equation you came up with. So we want to compute this Z. And it tells you how to form an online learning algorithm for Z, right? Because this is just an expectation. You replace it with a sampling estimate. So you have some Z hat, which is your approximation, and then you mix your old approximation with the new approximation, and the new approximation is given by whatever this thing is. Okay, so that's a very simple-minded learning algorithm. You can speed it up using importance sampling, as with most sampling algorithms. Here's a grid world where you're supposed to go here, and there are some obstacles. It's a comparison of Q-learning to two different flavors. One with random sampling, the other one speeding up with a greedy policy. And this is this Z-learning, especially if you look at the fast version of here, it's much faster than this. Like, see, this is converged. This guy is going to take a while to get there. So I should emphasize, this is not at all surprising that it works much faster than Q-learning. because we did a lot of work analytically, and we're getting a lot of mileage out of it. Q-learning is trying to solve a bigger and more unstructured problem, and of course, it's having a hard time. Here's how you can approximate shortest paths in graphs using this thing. So suppose you have a graph, and you build an indicator variable, dxy, which says if nodes x and y are connected, so it's 1 or 0. Now we're going to define the passive dynamics as a random walk on the graph. Okay, so probability of going to x and to y, if you don't act, is just a random walk. So you normalize by the number of outgoing edges. You define some terminal states where the cost of being there is 0. And then all other states have some constant cost. Okay, so the setting is that if you're in a non-terminal state, you pay cost c, and then once you get to a terminal state, you're happy and you don't pay cost anymore. Okay, so the value function obviously is going to be the length of the shortest path times c plus whatever you paid for the actions for these controls, these scale divergences. Okay, and now the trick is that I can make c as large as I want, while the control costs are bounded because these scale divergences are bounded. Okay, and so now if I divide by c, like shown here, in the limit of very large c, that's going to recover exactly the solution of the shortest path problem, because these extra costs are going to drop off. And yet, for every setting of c, I can solve the thing just by solving a largest eigenvalue problem. So it's faster than things like Dijkstra's algorithm, for example. Of course, it is an approximation because I cannot set c to infinity, so I have to live with some finite value of c. I cannot make it too large because I have these e to the negative c things, and numerically these things are going to go to 0 if I set c too large. But there's a convenient region of c where various types of errors are both 0, so you get the perfect solution. So this is an example on the graph of internet routers as of 2003, which I downloaded from somewhere. And so basically it gets all of them right. So this was an example where you take a shortest path problem, which is a specific problem, and you embed it in this continuous way, and then you can solve it very efficiently. You can take any other MDP, Markov decision process, with discrete actions, and you can embed it in this continuous family of problems, and then solve things there, and then map back. So it's a little bit like linear programming relaxation in integer programming. In fact, it has very similar properties to that. And the way you do that is you solve some system of linear equations at each state, and that sort of scales as order n. And it's very fast to solve. And here, some examples. So here's some other grid worlds. These are the correct optimal values. These are the approximate ones. And you get an R squared like 9.86. Here's another one. This is some sort of machine repair example. So here you have some machine it tends to break. Over time, the state denotes how broken it is. This is time. You can choose to repair it. So the actions are going to push this thing down, but you pay cost for repairs. So there's some optimal value function. This is our approximation, and the policy that we get out of the approximation is basically within 1% of the optimal. So it's a good thing. The last thing I'll show you is that, well, I don't think I'm going to show these equations, but basically you can now take this idea and transform it into a continuous setting. And the way you do that is, first we're going to replace our discrete state space with a Euclidean space, Rm. Okay? And we're going to define some passive dynamics in discrete time, but continuous state. Okay? So that's trivial. You just replace all the sums with integrals. Nothing magic happens. So the Bellman equation that we had before becomes this kind of thing. And then what you have to do is you have to take a continuous time limit very carefully. Okay? And you use tricks from stochastic calculus to do that, and you rearrange this equation. And basically what you get is the following. So you can have a continuous system where the state has some passive dynamics. It can be nonlinear, whatever you want. And then it has some noise. So that's the passive dynamic. So it's a nonlinear diffusion process. Okay? And then you define this linear differential operator, which is the dot product between this passive dynamics and the gradient of the function you're looking for. And then this 1/2 of the Hessian and the diffusion coefficient. So this is a very standard thing that you get from ethos calculus and stochastic differential equations. This is called a generator of the process. You can think of it as the expected value of the directional derivative of z under that. In fact, that's precisely what it computes. But importantly, it's a linear operator, right? So if I have z plus z prime, it's just going to add, because derivatives are linear. Okay, so if we were to go through this math, which we won't, you get the following result. So the exponentially transformed optimal value function for nonlinear diffusions has this form. So these are different formulations. You basically get a linear operator minus the state cost times the value function, and that has to be equal to something. So this is easy. This is an eigenvalue problem. This is a backward in time recursion. In the discounted cost, again, you get something nonlinear, but the rest of it sort of looks very much like it. Now, so it's important to realize that if you're solving a partial differential equation, the fact that it's linear doesn't mean you've solved it, because we can't. It's linear in the function z that you're looking for, but it's still nonlinear in the state of the system. However, this kind of second-order linear differential equations are very well studied, because most of the laws of physics are expressed in that form, and physicists have developed very powerful numerical techniques for solving them. And we can now take advantage of them and apply them to solving stochastic control problems. This is the problem that you end up solving. So this is the control dynamics, and the cost function turns out to be something that depends on the state plus this quadratic energy. So the KL divergence that we defined in the discrete case ends up being exactly the quadratic energy cost for continuous systems. And that's because the KL divergence between Gaussians is just a square distance between their means. So there's nothing magic about that. So we can use that to approximate continuous problems. Like this is a car on a hill thing. This little car wants to go there. This is the optimal value function computed with policy iteration. This is what we get. The control policy we get is just the same. So this is the CPU time. This is how good is the solution we find. So this new method is this. These are the best possible dynamic programming methods you can get. So we're about 10 times faster than the best possible dynamic programming. And the problem we're solving is a rather general problem, right? So again, any nonlinearities you want here. The constraints are that the control has to enter this thing in a linear way, but that's usually the case for most physical systems. And the noise has to act in the control space. And the cost function has to have this separate quadratic energy thing, but this can be whatever it wants. Okay. Last thing I'll mention is this. So when you have a linear PDE, that takes us back to the issue of motor synergies that we talked about earlier. So if you have a linear equation, you know that the solutions can be composed linearly. Okay? And that's very convenient if you want to build something like motor synergies or motor primitives or some building blocks that can be recombined to give you new solutions. Okay? So suppose I have a problem where I have some dynamical system, and it's going to hit some boundary condition, and that's when the movement ends. And I'm going to have some final cost over the boundary. Let's say I'm going to move to this table, and when I hit the table, I'm going to measure the distance from my finger to some target. Okay? And I can put the target in different places, or the target can even be some sort of irregular thing. Okay? So now I can solve the problem multiple times for different final costs, and suppose I get the solutions to this. Well, now what I'm doing is I'm solving the same linear PDE with different boundary conditions. Okay? And I know that if I were to combine the boundary conditions linearly, then the solutions are just going to combine linearly in the same way. Okay? So therefore, I get a very straightforward way for composing optimal control laws to get new optimal control laws for different problems. Okay, so here's an illustration. Here's just a simple point mass. This is position. This is time. Control is just very simple. We want the final cost could be a quadratic that can be centered somewhere. So this is known as a linear quadratic optimal control problem. If the final cost is indeed a quadratic like this, then we know how to solve this sort of in closed form using Riccati equations. You get a linear feedback control law. It looks like this. And then you get some histogram of final states, which is a Gaussian. Now we can combine two of those in closed form without doing any further optimization. And now I can solve things like that. So here now I have two of these final costs, and it asks me to do some bimodal thing. It says go either here or here, but not in the middle. Okay? Or I could have combined them in some other way and build up whatever shape of my cost function I want. Okay, so now we can solve not only these kinds of things, but also things that look like that, and this is a closed form solution, basically. So it's very promising in terms of being able to find primitives for optimal control and combine them. And we're hoping to explore that more. Okay, I should really end here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So, let's try to apply this kind of
So first I should say this is not a POMDP, this is an MDP. There's no uncertainty about the state here. If you put an uncertainty about the state, things become more complicated. I mean, we've done a little bit of that. So there's one slide that I skipped where we're doing that. So here we are, where is that slide? Here we're looking at people are moving around and they have to both track some target and learn how the mapping from this position sensor to the screen works, and that mapping is drifting. So there's uncertainty. So what we're doing is we're building a common filter to track the, to model the estimator, and then we're taking the mean and covariance of the common filter and embedding them into the plant dynamics. So now instead of having a partially observable low-dimensional system, we now have a fully observable high-dimensional system, which has been augmented with the common filter dynamics, basically. And now we can apply these methods there. So that's one way. Another way to do it is to just build your best estimator, treat it as if it was real, and proceed. I mean, POMDPs are, they scale very badly, and you can't deal with things that have more than like 100 states or something. And here we're dealing. So, for example, these discretizations I showed you for this car on a hill thing, these have close to 1 million discrete states, so you can't do a POMDP here. Sorry? Well, you can attempt, but it's not clear what the result is going to be.
No, your POMDP solvers can solve up to linear states.
How quickly now?
Point-based, fairly quickly, a few hours.
Okay, so that's not bad. I mean, still, this is like 10 seconds. A what? Point-based method?
Point-based method.
So some sort of particle filter estimating the state, is that what it is?
No, it's slightly more complicated. It's
Okay.
the way that you do the thermal analysis.
Okay. Yeah, so of course, I mean, putting uncertainty in this is important. But I mean, what you're asking, have people tried to use discrete sort of MDPs to solve continuous problems? And the answer is very rarely. So for example, Russ Tedrake at MIT did this biped locomotion thing with reinforcement learning. So that sounds great. But actually what he did is he did most of it by hand, and then reinforcement learning was optimizing some very low-dimensional sort of abstract control thing. So it's not really like dealing with the nonlinear dynamics. So basically, control suffers from the curse of dimensionality. When the dimensionality of the state space increases, the size of the grid that you need to put on it scales exponentially. So that basically means you can't do it. So you have to use various function approximation methods, but that's really hiding the problem under the hood, because you're still operating over space which is sort of exponentially large, and you don't know a priori what the solution is. So if you have to consider all possibilities, then you're screwed. With this, when you turn the thing into a linear PDE, there are amazingly efficient methods that you can do. So one of them is based on the Feynman-Cash theorem, which says that the solution to the second-order linear PDEs can be obtained by sampling from the passive dynamics. So in fact, when physicists solve high-dimensional PDEs, that's often one of the problems. So you start somewhere, and you let the thing just sample from the passive dynamics, and you accumulate the costs along the way. And that's guaranteed to converge to the answer to the PDE. And you can speed that up with importance sampling. So this really opens up new methods. So you can use sort of like Fourier methods or various basis functions. So for example, if you have a linear PDE and you're trying to approximate the solution with a basis function, so you have some basis set, and you use a linear function approximator, the PDE gives you linear algebraic equations for your coefficients. Okay? And if the basis functions have sort of finite support, they're relatively small, like Gaussians, for example, then that system becomes very sparse. So you can throw in sort of hundreds of thousands or millions of basis functions, and then you're solving a very large sparse system, and that's something we know how to handle. So being linear is a good thing. So I haven't yet taken advantage of this fully. I mean, it has taken me more than a year to develop the math, but now we're beginning to exploit the numerical sort of methods that you can develop based on that.
Questions? Thanks very much.
Thank you.